Let's talk about promoters. A promoter is someone who creates a new corporation. That's going to include anything you need to do to start a business, from raising the capital, from people called in the corporate context subscribers, seeing whether they can create a viable business plan, completing any sort of corporate formalities, for example, filing the articles of incorporation, creating the bylaws, issuing the stock. All of that is performed by promoters. Promoters are not agents of the corporation, and if you think about it, they can't be, because this is before the corporation even exists. So you can't be an agent for the corporation that doesn't exist. However, because you are in a position of trust and confidence, they do owe fiduciary duties. Now, what happens if there's a promoter who has put together a successful corporation? Who's liable for the contracts that the promoter may have entered prior to the corporation's existence? In other words, suppose the promoter entered contracts before the corporation existed. Is the corporation now liable for those contracts? Well, not automatically. Why? Because the corporation didn't even exist in this hypothetical. So you can't be liable for something before you were born. So no, they're not automatically liable. However, I would like you to know the following four terms, and they often apply to what happens when corporations take over contracts that were originally entered by the promoters. One term is called adoption, and that means that you're accepting the contract, knowing all the material facts, and remember that material means significant. They chose to adopt the contract. They chose to take that contract on. Ratification is a term we've come across before. It can be express or implied, and it means that you affirm a contract, that you agree to be bound by it, again, knowing all the material facts. How is adoption different from ratification? Not much. Sometimes you can characterize something as either one of them. It doesn't particularly matter. Adoption is the term you would use when a corporation formally agrees to be bound, but ratification can also be used if they don't formally agree to be bound. You can certainly imply that that's what they're doing under certain circumstances. Don't worry too much about the differences between those two terms. Assignment is when someone transfers their right to someone else, and all of these terms apply in many other contexts, incidentally, besides corporations. But this is how they apply in this context. So assignment means you have rights under a contract and you're giving those rights to someone else. So for example, if the promoter entered into a contract for the business, and now that the corporation has been created, the promoter may assign the rights under that contract to the corporation. Again, very similar to the idea of adoption and ratification. Don't worry too much about the distinctions here. What is different is novation. Novation is when all the parties agree on a substitution of the parties to a contract. What does that mean? Well, in this context, it would mean, suppose a promoter entered a contract before there was a corporation, so the contract was between the promoter and a vendor. A novation would be, now that the corporation exists, the corporation and the promoter go back to the vendor and say, we want to substitute out the promoter, cross his name off the contract, and substitute in the corporation. Just swap the parties. If everyone agrees to that, and there's no reason, frankly, for the vendor to agree to that, but if everyone agrees to that, this is called a novation. So, does the promoter become liable on contracts made by the corporation? Well, unless there's a novation, yes, because the original contract was entered with that promoter. She will remain liable unless the other party in the contract, the vendor, the landlord, the buyer, the seller, whoever it is, agrees to substitute out the parties, which is what happens with novation. Here's an example. Suppose that Jacob has a great new idea for his software product, but doesn't have much money of his own. He solicits others, including Crystal, Eden, and Kyoko, to agree to invest if he creates a corporation. In the meantime, Jacob, in his own name, rents business space from Arpy. Jacob then created Progression Inc., following all the necessary requirements. Progression Inc. moved into the rented space and began operations. Subsequently, the business became insolvent and stopped paying rent. When Arpy sues Jacob, Crystal, Eden, and Kyoko and Progression Inc., who's liable and on what causes of action? Well, when Jacob rented the space, there was no Progression Inc. Therefore, Jacob will be liable on the rental agreement. The only way he wouldn't be liable is if Arpy agreed to a novation, substituting Jacob out and Progression incorporated in. But that didn't happen here, so Jacob's liable. Are Crystal, Eden, and Kyoko liable? No. They're shareholders, and in the corporation, they are beneficiaries with the corporate shield. They're not personally liable on this. The worst thing that could happen just did happen. They lost their investment. Is Progression Inc. liable? Well, Arpy would argue yes. She would say that even though Progression Inc. didn't formally adopt the rental agreement as their own, she would say they knew the material facts related to the rental agreement, chose to accept the benefits of that rental agreement, and that they therefore have ratified the agreement and are subsequently liable. So you could call it adoption or ratification. You might have evidence that Jacob assigned the contract to Progression. Whichever of the three of these you use doesn't matter. Progression Inc. is probably liable under the rental agreement. Again, the textbook sometimes goes into much more detail than you need. What you need is what was just covered, so don't stress about this. Incidentally, you might wonder why the landlord would sue more than one party. In other words, isn't Jacob solely liable on his own? Why bother with Progression? Rule of thumb is you sue anyone who could be liable because you don't know who has assets and can satisfy any judgment you may get.